Some warnings are too honest to be ignored, even when no one else can hear them. Dawn spread slowly across the harbor, turning the calm Atlantic water into a sheet of pale silver as the passenger ferry Columbia Star prepared for another routine crossing from Portland, Maine. The air carried the familiar scent of salt, diesel fuel, and fresh coffee drifting from the terminal cafe where travelers hurried past one another with rolling suitcases and sleepy smiles. Families gathered near the boarding gates. Children pointed excitedly toward the massive white ship, and business travelers checked their watches with quiet impatience. It looked like the kind of ordinary morning that would be forgotten before sunset. Officer Ethan Carter knew better than to trust ordinary. At 36, the former U.S. Marine had learned that danger rarely announced itself with flashing lights or raised voices. More often, it arrived disguised as routine, hidden beneath calm faces and familiar places. Since leaving the Marine Corps, he had spent 6 years with the Harbor Police K-9 Division, relying on the instincts that had once kept him alive overseas. Yet even after hundreds of patrols, there was only one instinct he trusted more than his own. Beside him walked Valor, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a dark sable coat that shimmered beneath the rising sun and alert amber eyes that never stopped studying the world. The shepherd moved with disciplined confidence, every step measured, every breath deliberate, his nose quietly reading thousands of invisible scents drifting through the crowded terminal. Ethan rested one hand lightly on the leather leash, saying nothing. He never needed many words with Valor. Their partnership had been built through years of silent understanding, one earned decision at a time. Boarding had already begun when they stepped onto the lower passenger deck to complete a final security sweep. Crew members greeted Ethan with relaxed smiles. Passengers barely noticed the K-9 team weaving calmly through the crowd, and announcements echoed overhead reminding everyone to locate emergency exits after departure. Nothing seemed unusual. Then Valor stopped. Without warning, his body became perfectly still. His ears lifted. His tail froze. His eyes locked onto a medium-sized Navy suitcase resting beside an older gentleman wearing a gray windbreaker and a Boston Red Sox cap. The man appeared calm, scrolling quietly through messages on his phone while waiting to board. Valor inhaled once, then another time, each breath deeper than the last. Ethan felt the subtle tension travel through the leash. "What is it, buddy?" he whispered. Valor did not move. A second later, a deep bark shattered the morning calm. Conversations paused. Several passengers turned. The older man looked up, surprised more than frightened. Ethan gave the familiar command for Valor to disengage, but the shepherd ignored it. That had happened only twice before in 6 years. Valor barked again, louder this time, planting himself firmly between Ethan and the suitcase. Nearby security officers exchanged uncertain glances. A dock supervisor frowned and waved impatiently toward Ethan, clearly worried about delaying departure. Probably picked up somebody's lunch. One crewman joked with an uneasy laugh. Nobody else laughed. Valor lowered his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the luggage. He was not showing fear. He was warning them. Ethan felt an old sensation settle into his chest, the same quiet instinct he remembered from patrols overseas when silence somehow sounded louder than gunfire. Around them, the engines rumbled softly to life. Thick ropes securing the ferry strained against the dock. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries disappearing beneath the growing vibration of steel and water. The Columbia Star was only minutes from leaving the harbor. Still, Valor refused to step away. Instead, he released one slow, low growl that carried far more certainty than panic. Ethan looked at the motionless suitcase, then at the passengers smiling as they searched for seats, completely unaware that one stubborn German shepherd had just interrupted the most ordinary morning of their lives. The dock supervisor hurried over with a practiced smile that barely concealed his irritation. Delaying a scheduled departure meant paperwork, frustrated passengers, and questions from management that nobody wanted to answer on a quiet Tuesday morning. He glanced from Ethan to Valor and finally toward the Navy suitcase sitting exactly where its owner had left it. "Officer, we are already behind schedule," he said politely. "If the dog picked up something harmless, we can resolve it after departure." Ethan never answered immediately when Valor behaved this way. He had learned that patience often revealed what haste concealed. The German Shepherd had worked hundreds of assignments without a single false alert. During explosive certification, instructors joked that Valor could smell a memory left behind in the wind. Ethan had never believed in exaggeration, but he believed in the dog standing beside him. Years earlier, long before the ferry terminals and harbor patrols, Ethan had walked dusty roads half a world away wearing Marine Corps camouflage instead of a police uniform. Back then, another military working dog had refused to cross an abandoned bridge during what appeared to be an ordinary patrol. The route looked perfectly safe to every Marine in the convoy. The maps showed nothing unusual. Radio communications remained calm. Yet the dog had planted all four paws into the dirt and refused to move another inch. Some of the younger Marines had laughed, believing the animal had simply become stubborn in the afternoon heat. Ethan still remembered the calm voice of the senior handler. When the dog stops believing the ground, you stop believing it too. Minutes later, engineers discovered that recent floodwater had weakened the bridge beneath the surface. Nobody had been hurt that day because one dog trusted instincts stronger than human assumptions. Ethan had carried that lesson home long after his military service ended. Valor had reinforced it again and again. He had detected a concealed chemical leak inside a warehouse before sensors reacted. He had led rescuers toward an elderly fisherman who had collapsed beneath a pier during dense fog. He had even located a frightened 8-year-old girl hiding silently inside a maintenance shed after she wandered away from her family during a crowded holiday festival. Valor never searched for praise. He simply did his job with quiet determination, accepting nothing more than a gentle scratch behind the ears and Ethan's quiet voice telling him, "Good work, partner." The older passenger noticed the growing attention surrounding his luggage and slowly stepped forward, raising both hands with an expression of genuine confusion. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked. His voice remained steady, almost apologetic. "That is my suitcase. My name is Harold Bennett. I am heading to Nova Scotia to visit my daughter and my first grandchild." Ethan studied the man's face without seeing panic or anger. He saw tired eyes, silver hair, and the hopeful smile of someone looking forward to family. Nothing about Harold seemed threatening. Even so, Valor did not move. The shepherd shifted only once, lowering his nose closer to the suitcase before looking briefly toward Ethan with an intensity that needed no command to translate. The ferry horn echoed across the harbor, long and deep, vibrating through the steel deck beneath everyone's feet. Crew members untied the final docking lines while passengers drifted toward the railings to watch the shoreline. The Columbia Star had begun the point of no return, and somewhere beneath the sounds of engines, gulls, and restless conversations, Ethan realized Valor was no longer watching the suitcase alone. The dog's amber eyes lifted past Harold's shoulder and fixed quietly on someone else disappearing into the crowd. Valor did not bark again. That silence unsettled Ethan more than the warning itself. The German shepherd's breathing remained slow and controlled, his body balanced on strong legs as his gaze followed a tall man weaving naturally through the stream of passengers toward the upper observation deck. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance. He wore a navy pea coat despite the mild spring morning, carried no luggage, and never once looked back. Yet Valor watched him with unwavering focus before briefly turning his attention to the Navy suitcase again, as though connecting two invisible pieces of a puzzle that only he could sense. Ethan gently unclipped the short training lead from his belt and gave Valor just enough freedom to move while keeping him close. "Easy," he whispered. "Show me." The shepherd stepped forward without hesitation, stopping beside Harold Bennett once more before lifting his nose into the cool ocean breeze. Hundreds of scents drifted across the boarding deck. Salt water mixed with engine exhaust. Fresh pastries from the cafe blended with sunscreen, perfume, damp rope, polished wood, and the faint smell of seaweed carried by the outgoing tide. Valor sorted through them with astonishing patience. Then he quietly pivoted toward the stairwell leading to the upper deck. Harold looked from Ethan to the dog with growing concern. "Officer, I packed those bags myself," he said softly. "Clothes, gifts for my daughter, a stuffed bear for my grandson, and some homemade blueberry jam my neighbor insisted I bring." Ethan nodded reassuringly. "I believe you, sir. I simply need to understand why my partner is reacting this way." Harold stepped aside without protest. His willingness eased some of the tension gathering among nearby passengers, although curious whispers continued spreading across the deck. Several people had already taken out their phones, recording from a distance without understanding what they were witnessing. The dock's supervisor lowered his voice as he approached Ethan again. "The captain wants an update. We are already leaving the harbor." Ethan glanced through the wide ferry windows. The shoreline was drifting farther away with every passing second. Returning to the dock would soon become impossible without disrupting the entire crossing. He reached for his radio. "Bridge, this is Officer Carter. I request that no one handle the Navy suitcase until I complete a secondary assessment." The captain answered almost immediately. "Understood, officer. Keep me informed." Ethan appreciated the calm response. Panic often spread faster than facts, especially on a crowded passenger vessel. Valor began walking again, each step measured, leading Ethan toward the stairwell. Halfway there, the shepherd suddenly stopped beside a stainless steel ventilation grate built into the deck floor. He sniffed carefully around its edges before lifting his head toward the ceiling above them. Ethan followed his line of sight. Directly overhead stretched the upper observation lounge where dozens of passengers were settling into window seats to enjoy the morning voyage. Valor circled once, then looked back at the unattended suitcase, then up again toward the lounge. Not random. Never random. The pattern repeated with deliberate precision. Ethan felt the familiar certainty growing inside him. Whatever his partner was trying to communicate was larger than one piece of luggage. Somewhere beyond the obvious, another connection waited to be discovered. At that same moment, the tall man in the navy pea coat reached the upper deck railing. Without attracting attention, he rested one hand on the polished wood, looked briefly across the open water, and smiled with a quiet confidence that somehow made Ethan's instincts sharpen almost as strongly as Valor's. The sea had swallowed the shoreline behind them, leaving only a thin gray ribbon on the horizon as the Columbia Star settled into the steady rhythm of open water. Gentle waves brushed against the hull with a quiet, repetitive whisper that blended with the deep hum of the engines beneath the deck. Most passengers had relaxed again, drifting toward panoramic windows, ordering coffee, or taking photographs of gulls gliding effortlessly above the ferry. Whatever concern Valor had created only minutes earlier seemed to be fading from everyone except Ethan. The German shepherd suddenly lifted his head, nostrils flaring as another current of air swept through the ventilation system. Instead of pulling toward the staircase, he turned sharply and trotted toward a narrow maintenance corridor running beside the passenger lounge. Ethan followed immediately. The corridor was empty except for neatly stacked emergency equipment, polished metal cabinets, and the constant vibration of machinery hidden behind reinforced walls. Valor slowed his pace, pressing his nose close to a ventilation panel before stepping back. He listened, not with his ears alone, but with every muscle in his body. Then he looked directly at Ethan and gave one short bark. It was not an alarm meant for the crowd. It was a message meant only for his partner. Ethan crouched beside him, studying the vent. A faint stream of cool air drifted through the narrow openings. It carried the usual smells of machinery and seawater, yet beneath them lingered something unfamiliar. It was subtle enough that Ethan could barely notice it himself, but Valor reacted immediately. Before Ethan could examine the panel further, the ferry's chief engineer rounded the corner carrying a clipboard. "Everything all right, officer?" he asked. Ethan stood and nodded politely. "Has there been any maintenance involving this ventilation line recently?" The engineer thought for a moment. "Only routine inspections yesterday afternoon. Everything checked out perfectly." "What?" Ethan hesitated. He had no evidence, only a dog whose instincts had never failed him. "My partner believes something is not right." The engineer looked down at Valor with curiosity rather than skepticism. "That dog has a better record than most instruments I have worked with," he admitted. "If he is telling you something, I would rather listen." Ethan appreciated the answer. They removed the vent cover together, shining a flashlight into the narrow duct. The metal passage stretched several yards before disappearing into darkness. Nothing appeared unusual. No loose wiring. No damaged insulation. No obstruction. Yet Valor refused to leave. He sniffed again, then unexpectedly backed away from the opening and turned toward the passenger lounge overhead. His ears stood perfectly straight. His breathing quickened. Somewhere above them, footsteps echoed across the ceiling. Ethan recognized the cadence almost immediately. Someone was moving slowly, stopping every few seconds, then continuing again. Not wandering, watching. Valor started toward the stairwell with renewed determination. Ethan clipped the leash back onto his harness and followed without hesitation. As they reached the upper observation deck, sunlight poured through the wide windows, casting golden reflections across polished floors and smiling faces. Children laughed while pointing at distant fishing boats. Couples leaned against the railings, enjoying the cool breeze rolling across the Atlantic. Everything looked peaceful. Then Ethan spotted the tall man in the navy pea coat once again. He was no longer admiring the ocean. Instead, he stood quietly near the center of the lounge, his eyes fixed not on the sea, not on the passengers, but on Harold Bennett's unattended navy suitcase 2 levels below, visible through the open central atrium. At that exact moment, Valor released a low growl so steady and certain that Ethan no longer believed the suitcase itself was the destination. It had become a signal pointing towards someone who had been waiting for everyone else to look in the wrong direction. The observation lounge remained peaceful for only a few more moments. Then the lights flickered once, so briefly that most passengers dismissed it as nothing more than the ferry's engines adjusting to open water. Coffee cups rattled softly against their saucers. A child looked up from the window, wondering why the ceiling lights had blinked. Somewhere below the deck, a warning tone chimed for less than a second before falling silent again. Ethan instinctively reached for his radio. "Bridge, this is Officer Carter. I just observed a brief power fluctuation. Can engineering confirm system status?" A calm voice answered almost immediately. "Minor voltage variation. No operational concerns at this time." The reply sounded reassuring, yet Valor remained completely unconvinced. The German shepherd stepped away from the railing and began circling slowly across the observation lounge, his nose tracing invisible currents drifting through the air. He paused beside one family, then moved on without hesitation. He ignored a service cart filled with hot coffee. He ignored a stack of luggage near the elevators. Finally, he stopped beneath another ceiling vent and stared upward once again. Ethan followed his eyes. The ventilation grills stretched the length of the lounge, quietly circulating fresh ocean air throughout the passenger decks. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Valor's posture tightened exactly as it had beside Harold Bennett's suitcase. The shepherd looked toward Ethan, then toward the vent, then back toward the central atrium where the Navy's suitcase still rested below under the watch of another harbor officer. The connection became impossible to ignore. The suitcase and the ventilation system somehow belonged to the same story. Before Ethan could investigate further, hurried footsteps echoed from the lower level. A young crew member appeared slightly out of breath, but trying to remain composed. "Officer Carter," she said quietly. "Captain Reynolds would like you on the bridge as soon as possible." Ethan nodded, but Valor did not move. His attention had shifted again. Across the lounge, the tall man in the navy pea coat calmly folded a tourist map and slipped it into his pocket. He glanced casually toward the panoramic windows, smiled politely at an elderly couple passing by, then disappeared through a side doorway leading toward the ferry's conference rooms. His behavior remained perfectly ordinary. Too ordinary. Ethan looked toward the crew member. "Tell the captain I will be there in 2 minutes." As soon as she left, he followed the man through the doorway with Valor close beside him. The conference hallway was quiet and lined with empty meeting rooms prepared for private events during longer crossings. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, painting bright rectangles across polished wooden floors. The man was nowhere in sight. Ethan checked each doorway. Empty. Storage closets. Empty. Restrooms. Empty. It was as though the passenger had simply dissolved into the ship itself. Then Valor froze beside a decorative brass trash receptacle near the end of the corridor. Instead of barking, he lowered his nose toward the floor where only a tiny scrap of dark blue fabric rested against the baseboard, almost invisible unless someone was looking for it. Ethan carefully picked it up with a clean evidence glove from his utility pouch. The fabric carried a faint chemical odor unlike anything found elsewhere aboard the ferry. Valor sniffed the cloth once before immediately turning his head toward the ventilation duct running overhead. At that exact moment, another brief flicker passed through the lights, lasting slightly longer than the first. Conversations paused throughout the ship. The engines continued their steady rhythm, but beneath the familiar vibration, Ethan sensed something changing. Around him, passengers still laughed, children still pressed their faces against the windows, and the Atlantic still sparkled beneath the morning sun. Only Ethan and Valor understood that whatever had begun at the dock had not ended after the ferry left shore. It had quietly followed every soul aboard into the open sea. Captain Reynolds was waiting on the bridge with remarkable composure, though the lines around his eyes revealed that he understood far more than he allowed the passengers to see. Large windows framed an endless sweep of blue Atlantic water, while radar screens glowed quietly beneath the steady hands of experienced officers. Ethan handed him the small piece of blue fabric sealed inside an evidence pouch. The captain examined it carefully before passing it to the chief engineer, who immediately frowned. "This does not belong anywhere on this vessel," he said. "It looks like part of an industrial filtration liner, but the odor is unusual." Ethan nodded. Valor traced the same scent from the suitcase to the ventilation system. Captain Reynolds pressed the intercom button without raising his voice. "Engineering, begin a full inspection of every accessible ventilation junction. Quietly. I do not want unnecessary concern among the passengers." Within moments, technicians spread throughout the ferry, communicating calmly through headsets while continuing normal operations. Outside the bridge windows, nothing suggested that anything unusual was happening. The sea sparkled beneath the late morning sun, and seabirds drifted effortlessly behind the ferry's wake. Yet inside the ship, every passing minute carried greater weight. Ethan returned to the central passenger deck, with Valor leading the way. Harold Bennett remained seated exactly where another officer had asked him to wait. His Navy suitcase had not been touched. Harold looked exhausted now, not because he feared being accused of anything, but because he feared missing the chance to meet his new grandson. "Officer," he said quietly, "if opening my luggage helps everyone feel safe, please do it." Ethan offered a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett." With Harold's permission witnessed by 2 crew members, Ethan carefully unlatched the suitcase. Valor watched silently, neither barking nor pulling forward. Inside lay neatly folded clothes, wrapped gifts, family photographs inside a small album, homemade jars of blueberry jam protected with towels, children's storybooks, and a hand-knitted baby blanket decorated with tiny sailboats. Everything reflected exactly the life Harold had described. The passengers watching from a respectful distance released quiet sighs of relief. Harold lowered his head for a moment, almost embarrassed by the attention. Ethan gently closed the suitcase. "I am sorry for the delay, sir." Harold smiled kindly. "If that beautiful dog thought something was wrong, then I would rather he checked than stayed silent." Valor stepped closer to Harold and briefly rested his nose against the older man's hand. Harold instinctively stroked the shepherd's head. It was the first time since boarding that Valor appeared completely relaxed near the suitcase. Ethan immediately understood. The luggage had never been the true source of danger. It had simply carried a faint trace left by someone else. Almost at the same instant, Ethan's radio crackled. "Officer Carter," the chief engineer reported, his normally steady voice now edged with concern. "We found fresh fibers matching your evidence inside a ventilation access panel near Conference Room 3. There are also signs that someone removed and replaced the cover recently." Ethan's eyes met Valor's amber gaze. The shepherd stood, ears forward, already facing the corridor without waiting for a command. Whatever invisible trail he had been following since the dock was finally beginning to make sense. The suitcase had pointed them toward a scent. The scent had pointed them toward the ventilation system. And now the ventilation system was pointing them toward someone who had quietly moved through the ship long before anyone realized they were being guided in exactly the wrong direction. Valor surged forward with calm determination, not pulling wildly against the leash, but moving with the unmistakable confidence of a partner who had finally found the trail he had been searching for since the ferry left the dock. Ethan trusted that certainty without hesitation. Together, they followed the narrow corridor toward Conference Room 3 while the steady vibration of the engines echoed beneath their boots. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beyond the windows, peaceful and bright, completely unaware of the quiet race unfolding inside the vessel. 2 engineers were already waiting beside the open ventilation panel. One of them held a flashlight, while the other pointed toward a series of fresh scuff marks along the metal frame. "Someone removed the cover recently," he said. "The screws were tightened again, but not with our maintenance tools." Ethan crouched beside the opening. The duct disappeared into darkness, carrying cool air toward every passenger area on board. Valor lowered his head to the opening, inhaled deeply, then backed away almost immediately. Instead of continuing to investigate the vent, he turned sharply toward the emergency stairwell leading one deck higher. Ethan recognized the pattern instantly. The dog was no longer tracking where the scent had been. He was tracking where it had gone. They climbed quickly, but without alarming anyone they passed. Families continued enjoying the voyage. Children laughed as they counted seabirds gliding beside the ferry. An elderly couple shared sandwiches near the observation windows. Crew members smiled politely as they moved between passengers. The ordinary rhythm of the crossing continued, creating a strange contrast to the growing urgency inside Ethan's mind. At the top of the stairwell, Valor paused beside a service door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." His ears lifted. His breathing slowed. Ethan opened the door carefully. Beyond it stretched a narrow maintenance passage running above the passenger ceilings where electrical conduits, ventilation ducts, and communication cables crossed beneath exposed steel beams. The air smelled of warm metal, machine oil, and filtered sea salt. Dust floated lazily through narrow shafts of sunlight entering from inspection windows. Valor walked several yards before stopping beside another ventilation junction. He looked upward, then slowly toward a small maintenance hatch that opened onto the upper exterior deck. The hatch was not fully closed. A thin ribbon of daylight slipped through the gap. Ethan gently pushed it open. Cool ocean wind rushed inside, carrying the cries of gulls and the scent of salt water. The upper deck appeared nearly empty except for a few passengers taking photographs near the bow. Then Ethan noticed someone walking away with calm, deliberate steps. The tall man in the navy pea coat never looked back. He simply continued toward the far observation platform as though he belonged there. Ethan called out in a firm but respectful voice, "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" The man stopped. He turned slowly, offering a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked. His voice remained remarkably steady despite the attention now focused on him. Before Ethan could answer, Valor stepped forward and sat directly between the man and the nearest stairwell. No barking, no growling, only complete concentration. It was the behavior he displayed whenever he believed someone should not continue moving until Ethan understood the full picture. The man glanced at the German shepherd and chuckled softly. "Beautiful animal," he said. "He seems to take his job seriously." "He does," Ethan replied. "May I ask your name?" "Daniel Mercer." "Are you traveling alone today?" "I am." "Do you mind if I ask where your luggage is?" For the first time, the smile faded ever so slightly. Daniel looked toward the endless blue horizon before answering. "I only brought a small backpack." Ethan noticed it immediately. A compact navy backpack rested against the railing only a few feet away. Its fabric matched the tiny fibers recovered near the ventilation panel almost perfectly. Before anyone moved another inch, Valor quietly rose and walked toward the backpack. He stopped several feet away, remaining perfectly still. He neither touched it nor barked. He simply looked at Ethan with calm, unwavering certainty, the same silent message he had delivered from the very beginning. The suitcase had been only a borrowed scent. The real trail had always led here, to one quiet passenger standing beneath an open sky, where every choice from this moment forward would depend not on fear, but on whether Ethan continued trusting the partner who had never once asked him to doubt. Daniel Mercer looked from Ethan to Valor, and then toward the quiet horizon where the Atlantic met the pale blue sky. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The breeze carried the scent of salt and distant rain, while the ferry continued its steady course across open water. Passengers nearby remained unaware that an entire conversation was unfolding without raised voices or hurried footsteps. Ethan kept his tone calm. "Sir, I need you to step away from the backpack." Daniel studied the German shepherd with thoughtful eyes before giving a slow nod. "Your dog figured it out before anyone else did," he said softly. He stepped back exactly as requested, keeping his hands visible. There was no panic in his movements, only the expression of someone who realized the moment for silence had ended. Captain Reynolds arrived with 2 additional harbor officers, responding quietly after Ethan's brief radio update. No flashing alarms echoed through the decks. No frightened announcements interrupted the voyage. The captain understood that keeping hundreds of passengers calm required steady leadership rather than dramatic gestures. Ethan carefully approached the backpack, while Valor remained seated several feet away, watching every movement with unwavering focus. The chief engineer joined them carrying portable inspection equipment. After a careful examination, he unzipped the bag under controlled conditions. Inside were rolled maintenance diagrams, several electronic components, specialized communication devices, and pieces of industrial ventilation fabric identical to those recovered near the service duct. There was nothing immediately dangerous inside, but there was enough to raise serious questions. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking. "I never intended for anyone to get hurt," he said quietly. "Someone asked me to place equipment inside the ventilation system so another person could retrieve it after the ferry reached Nova Scotia. They told me it was only unauthorized communication hardware that would avoid customs inspections." Ethan listened without interrupting. "Then why leave traces through the ventilation system?" Daniel sighed heavily. "Because I became nervous after boarding. I realized I had made a terrible decision. I tried removing everything, but I left behind pieces of the filter lining while putting the panels back. When your dog barked at that gentleman's suitcase, I understood that some of the material I handled must have transferred when I accidentally brushed against his luggage during boarding." Ethan finally saw the entire chain of events. Harold Bennett had never been connected to the hidden equipment. His suitcase had simply carried the faint scent left by another passenger. Valor had recognized the scent immediately, but continued following it until he found its true source. Captain Reynolds thanked Daniel for cooperating and instructed the officers to escort him respectfully to a private interview room while authorities on shore were notified. The process remained calm, orderly, and almost unnoticed by the families enjoying their morning crossing. Minutes later, engineers completed a full inspection of the ventilation network and confirmed that nothing capable of endangering passengers remained aboard. A quiet sense of relief settled across the crew like the warm sunlight now pouring over the decks. Harold Bennett approached Ethan once everything had concluded. He smiled warmly before kneeling with surprising ease for a man of his age. Valor walked over without hesitation, gently resting his head beneath Harold's weathered hand. "Looks like he was protecting all of us," Harold whispered. Ethan smiled as he scratched behind Valor's ears. "He usually is." The shepherd leaned briefly against Ethan's leg, his amber eyes finally softening after hours of silent vigilance. The tension that had filled his body since sunrise slowly disappeared into the peaceful rhythm of waves brushing against the ferry's hull, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that sometimes the greatest act of courage is refusing to ignore the smallest warning. The Columbia Star reached the Nova Scotia shoreline beneath a sky brushed with soft streaks of gold and pale blue. The morning having quietly given way to early afternoon, without most passengers ever realizing how different the journey might have become. The harbor welcomed the ferry with the familiar sounds of gulls circling overhead, mooring lines tightening against polished docks, and distant bells carried gently across the water. Families gathered their bags, children laughed as they raced toward the exit, and travelers stepped onto solid ground carrying nothing more than memories of another peaceful crossing. Only a handful of crew members truly understood how much they owed to one German shepherd who had refused to accept what everyone else believed. Harbor authorities met Captain Reynolds at the terminal while investigators carefully took custody of the recovered equipment and continued speaking with Daniel Mercer. Throughout the entire process, Ethan noticed that Daniel never once blamed the dog. As he was escorted away, he paused for a brief moment and looked back toward Valor. A quiet sadness crossed his face before he nodded almost imperceptibly. "He gave me the chance to tell the truth before my mistakes became someone else's burden," he said softly. Ethan offered no judgment. He simply returned the nod, believing that accountability often began with a single honest decision. Harold Bennett finally embraced his daughter on the dock while tears of happiness filled both their eyes. A tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket slept peacefully in her arms, completely unaware of the unexpected chain of events that had almost delayed their first meeting. Harold smiled as he walked back toward Ethan one last time. From the gift bag beside the stroller, he carefully removed the small stuffed bear he had packed so lovingly that morning. Kneeling beside Valor, he let the German shepherd sniff the toy before gently placing a hand against the dog's broad neck. "My grandson will grow up hearing about the brave officer who protected him before he even knew he was here," Harold whispered. "But I will also tell him about the dog who trusted his heart when nobody else understood." Ethan felt his throat tighten as Valor leaned quietly into Harold's gentle touch. There was no excitement in the shepherd's posture now, only peace. Later that evening, after reports had been completed and the ferry had emptied into the quiet rhythm of the harbor, Ethan returned to the upper observation deck alone with his partner. The Atlantic rolled beneath them in long, patient swells that reflected the fading sunlight like molten copper. A cool breeze stirred Valor's sable coat as he sat beside Ethan, watching the endless horizon without moving. Ethan removed the leash from his partner's harness for a few moments and rested one hand against the familiar warmth of the shepherd's shoulder. "You knew," he said quietly, "long before any of us did." Valor answered the only way he ever had, by lifting his eyes toward Ethan with complete trust. No medals were presented that day. No television cameras captured the quiet partnership that had unfolded aboard the ferry. There was only a harbor settling into evening, a faithful dog resting beside the man who had chosen to believe him, and the quiet understanding that miracles do not always arrive as impossible events. Sometimes they begin with a single bark, a patient heart willing to listen, and the kind of loyalty that asks for nothing in return except the chance to protect strangers who will never know how close they came to needing a hero.